Uh-oh. I could not forget it was Wednesday because, as you may have seen from all of my social media posting today, Couch Warrior, welcome, hello. Yeah, today is World Read Aloud Day. Kind of a clunky name. I do like the acronym WRAD. So there's this group called Lit World, and they are all about, getting kids to read and encouraging literacy all around the world. So they made World Read Aloud Day. And I did not know this was a thing until a couple months ago. I got a message from my publisher saying, hey, World Read Aloud Day is coming. If you want to be involved, respond to this Google form and things may happen. So, okay, cool. So I filled out the Google form. And again, it was for authors. Although, I mean, really anybody should be able to participate in this. But, it said, who are you? What book have you written with what publisher? And then it said very, very specifically, what age group would be appropriate for you to talk to? And the choices were grade school, so anything up to like 5th or 6th grade, middle school, so there's like an overlap depending on if you have a junior high or middle school, it's silly, and then high school. And those were my only 3 choices, and they were radio buttons, so you couldn't click on multiple. So I was like, I don't know, I mean, I can talk to anybody, but I guess middle school? So I clicked that one, sent it off. And then over the last couple of months, I've heard back from a few schools, mostly on the East Coast, for some reason. I don't know why, but yeah. So last night I recorded a video presentation for a school in just outside of Boston. Sent that off. I assume they watched it this morning. I don't actually know. I haven't heard back. And then, yeah, last hour I talked to a class of 5th graders in, where the heck were they? Somewhere on the East Coast again. But it was fine. It went well. It was actually really interesting. The kids were in a classroom, but they each had their own device, so I couldn't get a sense of how close they were to each other. They must have been fairly spaced out. They were all wearing masks. Like I said, they each had their own device. I don't know if it was a laptop or an iPad. I talked to random kids, it's true. But we did it over Zoom, and I talked for a while. They had come up with some questions for me in advance. So the teacher had clearly said, here's our author who's going to come and talk to us. Here's his book. So their questions they ranged from, like what were the challenges in writing all the way through, like how did you, or how much do you love Star Wars and what's your favorite Star Wars character? So it was a nice range of questions. And then at the end, I asked if any of the kids had questions, and one of them wanted to know how many toys I had. I was like, oh, okay, that's good. Welcome everyone who is coming in. But yeah, it went well. I talked about writing, about reading, about publishing. What was the other? Oh, so talking about Star Wars, I explained that I've been a lifelong Star Wars fan since I was a little kid. And then I was about to talk about how when I was growing up, we had VHS tapes of the first 3 movies that we would watch over and over again. And I caught myself, again, I'm talking to 5th graders, and I said, just a quick show of hands, how many of you know what a VHS is? And I think 2 raised their hands out of the whole class. So I was all right, at least a couple of you know. So yeah, so there was at least one aspiring toy collector among the bunch. In theory, I have 2 more appointments today to read to students, although they came in later, so I don't know if they're happening or not. We'll see. Teachers are very busy, and I understand this. I also wrote an article about reading out loud for the Lit World website. I don't know if it's online yet or if it's going to be, but whatever. I realized when Betamax, oh my god, Betamax was so much better than VHS. Why didn't we get to keep Betamax? I realized that when I was doing some of this prep work for Read Aloud Day, obviously I read out loud to my children. That's a no-brainer. But then, like I said, I realized that during the pandemic, I've gotten to read a lot of things out loud, and it's been really, really cool. obviously reading the Dune books with Jessica, and then just here on my Monday streams reading ancient mythology and Russian folk tales, fairy tales, and everything. Like, I'm doing a lot of reading out loud these days, and it's been really cool. I've really enjoyed it. Hopefully, other people who listen to me also enjoy it. So I thought, because it is Warhammer Wednesday, but it is also World Read Aloud Day, that I would read some passages from a couple Warhammer books. Warhammer books do range pretty widely from these massive tomes. Most Warhammer books are well over 300 pages. They do have a line of young adult books. This is the very first one that came out, and I'm reading it with Benjamin off and on, slowly when we get to it. We have other things that we read, obviously, but these are kind of cool because there's a series for Warhammer 40k and a series for fantasy, and they actually got some really cool actors to do the audiobooks for these. So David Tennant does the 40k books, and then Billy Piper does the fantasy books. I think I have that right. I think that's the right way. So yeah, so like David Tennant reviewed the book on the back, which is neat. So if you're a Doctor Who fan, then you can. Yeah, Rabbit Wombat, they always have those things like you could still get this, up to this day. But it's like, well, I mean, sure, if you have like you're not seeing them on store shelves. What kind of crazy cult sacrifice do you have to make to get Betamax movies and tapes, at least in 2016? Sure, somebody had access to them. We didn't. Okay, so I thought that I would go back to the very beginning. The very beginning? Beginning of what? Obviously, I'm a big Warhammer fan. When it comes to the stories and the fiction, I really like the Horus Heresy timeline, the characters, the books. I have a conference call. Okay, good luck with your conference call. So I'm going to read from some Horus Heresy books, and I'm going to start with the very first one. So I'm going to start from the very beginning of the first one. So this is the book Horus Rising by Dan Abnett. When did this book come out? There's so much information at the beginning of every book. Oh, come on, I know it's a special edition, blah, blah, 2008. Okay. So thank you for that. So Warhammer 40k has been around since arguably since the late 80s, but they didn't actually start putting these stories into print until 2008. And again, like the community, knew about these stories and knew about these characters for a long time, but now we're actually getting the descriptions of what happened. So this book starts out really interestingly because it just dives in, and it doesn't open slowly. So here's the beginning of the first Horus Heresy book. I was there, he would say afterwards, until afterwards became a time quite devoid of laughter. I was there the day Horus slew the Emperor. It was a delicious conceit, and his comrades would chuckle at the sheer treason of it. The story was a good one. Torgadon would usually be the one to cajole him into telling it, for Torgadon was the joker, a man of mighty laughter and idiot tricks. And Loken would tell it again, a tale rehearsed through so many retellings it almost told itself. Loken was always careful to make sure his audience properly understood the irony in his story. It was likely that he felt some shame about his complicity in the matter itself, for it was a case of blood spilled from misunderstanding. There was a great tragedy implicit in the tale of this emperor's murder, a tragedy that Loken always wanted his listeners to appreciate. But the death of Sejanus was usually all that fixed their attentions. That, and the punchline. So again, like, this just dives right in. And when I first read this, I was like, what the hell is going on? Who are these characters? But yeah, I think Abnett did a really interesting, it's an interesting style just to go. You'll catch up, you'll figure it out on the way. You may go back and reread it one day. So this is Loken, a character that, as of this point, we only know as Loken, explaining about the story, based on the famous line, "I was there the day Horus slew the Emperor." It had been, as far as the warp-dilated horologs could attest, the 203rd year of the Great Crusade. Loken always set his story in its proper time and place. The commander had been War Master for about a year, since the triumphant conclusion of the Olenor campaign, and he was anxious to prove his newfound status, particularly in the eyes of his brothers. War Master. Such a title. The fit was still new and unnatural, not yet worn in. It was a strange time to be abroad among stars. They had been doing what they had been doing for 2 centuries, but now it felt unfamiliar. It was a start of things, and an ending too. The ships of the 63rd expedition came upon the Imperium by chance. A sudden etheric storm, later declared providential by Malagurst, forced a route alteration, and they translated into the edges of a system comprising 9 worlds. 9 worlds circling a yellow sun. Detecting the shoal of rugged expedition warships on station at the out-system edges, the Emperor first demanded to know their occupation and agenda. Then he painstakingly corrected what he saw as the multifarious errors in their response. Then he demanded fealty. He was, he explained, the Emperor of mankind. He had stoically shepherded his people through the miserable epoch of warp storms, through the age of strife, staunchly maintaining the rule and law of man. This had been expected of him, he declared. He had kept the flame of human culture alight through the aching isolation of old night. He had sustained this precious vital fragment and kept it intact until such time as the scattered diaspora of humanity re-established contact. He rejoiced that such a time was now at hand. His soul leapt to see the orphan ships returning to the heart of the Imperium. Everything was ready and waiting. Everything had been preserved. The orphans would be embraced to his bosom, and then the great scheme of rebuilding would begin, and the Imperium of mankind would stretch itself out again across the stars, as was its birthright, as soon as they showed him proper fealty, as Emperor of mankind. The commander, quite entertained by all accounts, sent Hastur Sejanus to meet with the Emperor and deliver greetings. So I will take a second to stop. So what might not be clear here are the Space Marines under the command of Horus. These are specifically his legion. They've gone out into the universe to find humans, to rescue humans, to free planets that used to be under human control from now aliens. And they come across what we as readers will say, oh, that sounds like our solar system. Wait, they came across an Emperor of mankind who rescued humanity in a far-flung place, and he's demanding fealty of them? Like, what's going on here? But this is another Emperor of mankind they have found, who demands fealty from them when they show up. Sejanus was the commander's favorite, not as proud or irascible as Abaddon, nor as ruthless as Sedere, nor even as solid and venerable as Iacton Cruz. Sejanus was the perfect captain, tempered evenly in all respects. A warrior and a diplomat in equal measure, Sejanus's martial record, second only to Abaddon's, was easily forgotten when in company with the man himself. A beautiful man, Loken would say, building his tale, a beautiful man adored by all. No finer figure in Mark IV plate than Hastur Sejanus. That he is remembered, and his deeds celebrated even here amongst us, speaks of Sejanus's qualities. The noblest hero of the Great Crusade. That was how Loken would describe him to the eager listeners. In future times, he will be recalled with such fondness that men will name their sons after him. Sejanus with we have the Emperor at home. Sejanus, with a squad of his finest warriors from the 4th Company, traveled in-system in a gilded barge and was received for audience by the Emperor at his palace on the 3rd planet. And killed. Murdered. Hacked down on the onyx floor of the palace even as he stood before the Emperor's golden throne. Sejanus and his glory squad, Deimos, Malsandar, Gorthoi, and the rest, all slaughtered by the Emperor's elite guard, the so-called Invisibles. Apparently, Sejanus had not offered the correct fealty. Indelicately, he had suggested there might actually be another Emperor. The commander's grief was absolute. He had loved Sejanus like a son. They had warred side by side to effect compliance on 100 worlds. But the commander, always sanguine and wise in such matters, told his signalmen to offer the Emperor another chance. The commander detested resorting to war and always sought alternative paths away from violence where such were workable. This was a mistake, he reasoned, a terrible, terrible mistake. Peace could be salvaged. This Emperor could be made to understand. It was about then, Loken liked to add, that a suggestion of quote marks began to appear around the Emperor's name. It was determined that a second embassy would be dispatched. Malagurst volunteered at once. The commander agreed, but ordered the spear tip forwards into assault range. The intent was clear. One hand extended open in peace, the other held ready as a fist. If the second embassy failed or was similarly met with violence, then the fist would already be in position to strike. That somber day, Loken said, the honor of the spear tip had fallen, by the customary drawing of lots, to the strengths of Abaddon, Torgadon, little Horus Aximand, and Loken himself. At the order, battle musters began. The ships of the spear tip slipped forward, running under obscurement. On board, stormbirds were hauled onto their launch carriages. Weapons were issued and certified. Oaths of moment were sworn and witnessed. Armor was machined into place around the anointed bodies of the chosen. In silence, tensed and ready to be unleashed, the spear tip watched as the shuttle convoy bearing Malagurst. Thank you so much, Black Cavalier, for resubscribing 4 months. Woohoo! And yes, names all over the place, and I'll talk about that in just a second, because I have something to talk about here. They watched as the shuttle convoy bearing Malagurst and his envoy arced down toward the third planet. Surface batteries smashed them out of the heavens. As the burning scads of debris from Malagurst's flotilla billowed away into the atmosphere, the Emperor's fleet elements rose up out of the oceans, out of the high cloud, out of the gravity wells of nearby moons. 600 warships revealed and armed for war. Abaddon broke obscurement and made a final personal plea to the Emperor, beseeching him to see sense. The warships began to fire on Abaddon's spear tip. My commander, Abaddon relayed to the heart of the waiting fleet, there is no dealing here. This fool impostor will not listen. And the commander replied, illuminate him, my son, but spare all you can. That order notwithstanding, avenge the blood of my noble Sejanus. Decimate this Emperor's elite murderers, and bring the impostor to me. And so, Loken would sigh, we made war upon our brethren, so lost in ignorance. So that's how, and then it goes on to the actual troops that land on the planet and attack this palace. Yeah, so now obviously, Abnett is building in, he's teasing, right? That Loken, who we find out is a captain among this legion under Horus, he's saying, I was there the day Horus slew the Emperor. Well, now we know, even when this book came out, we as Warhammer fans, we know that the Emperor killed Horus. So it's like, wait, what's going on? Horus didn't slay the Emperor. And then we get this really cool story of the Legion going out and finding this solar system with 9 planets, with an Emperor of mankind on the 3rd planet, and they go and meet with him, and of course there's violence, and they have to eventually kill him and all of this stuff. But I like to point out, and it seems like it's just kind of a silly story, and you know, it's like it catches your eye and your ear, because again, it talks about how, you know, what, Horus slew the Emperor. It's crazy. But I think there's more to this story. And I've posited among Warhammer nerds and fans that this moment, the death of Hastur Sejanus, is really the origin of Horus's fall. Throughout the Horus Heresy novels, and again, there have been almost 60 of them, or more if you count all of the short stories and the anthologies, every so often there'll be references to this event, and the fact that before this, that Hastur Sejanus, who was great in all respects, but not the wisest, not the best fighter or anything else, but just a really good guy and a good friend to Horus, And when he lost him, it really affected Horus. And yes, so many names taken from other places. Hastur, which is a name I hesitate every time I say it. Hastur does come from H.P. Lovecraft. It is now a part of the cosmic horror umbrella. It's been used by other authors too, but Hastur is one of these great old ones, and he's one. Yeah, exactly, the King in Yellow. You're not supposed to say his or its name because that focuses its attention on you from where it lives in outer space. Traditionally, Hastur lives on Carcosa, which is somewhere in, I think it's in the Aldebaran system, technically. I don't know. But anyway, so there's Hastur, yeah, and then Sejanus is also a name that comes from Roman mythology. So there's a lot built in. I know, Rabbit Wombat, I'm just saying it. Hopefully it doesn't end badly for me. But yeah, so that's how the very beginning opens. Let me jump ahead to some fighting. So as the book goes on, it's not just about the Luna Wolves. We also hear about some of the other legions in the very first book. Yeah, I'm sorry, Black Cavalry. That's right. I always forget which one was the original one because when Lovecraft and Chambers, when that group was writing, they sort of shared characters and creatures and things. So we move on in the same book, and we get a story about a certain planet that the Space Marines have come to. Even after he'd slain a fair number of them, Saul Tarvitz was still unable to say with any certainty where the biology of the megarachnids stopped and their technology began. They were the most seamless things, a perfect fusion of artifice and organism. They did not wear their armor or carry their weapons. Their armor was an integument bonded to their anthropod shells, and they possessed weapons as naturally as a man might own fingers or a mouth. Tarvitz loathed them and loved them too. He loathed them for their abominable want of human perfection. He loved them because they were genuinely testing foes, and in mastering them, the Emperor's children would take another stride closer to attaining their full potential. We always need a rival, his Lord Eidolon had once said, and the words had stuck forever in Tarvitz's mind. A true rival of considerable strength and fortitude. Only against such a rival can our prowess be properly measured. There was more at stake here than the Legion's prowess, however, and Tarvitz understood this solemnly. Brother Astartes were in trouble, and this was a mission, though no one had dared actually use the term, of rescue. It was thoroughly improper to openly suggest that the Blood Angels needed rescuing. Reinforcement. That was the word they had been told to use, but it was hard to reinforce what you could not find. They had been on the surface of murder for 66 hours and had found no sign of the 140th Expedition forces. Or even, for the most part, of each other. Lord Commander Eidolon had committed the entire company to the surface drop. The descent had been foul, worse than the warnings they had been given prior to the drop, and the warnings had been grim enough. Nightmarish atmospherics had scattered their drop pods like chaff, casting them wildly astray from their projected landing vectors. Tarvitz knew it was likely many pods hadn't even made it to the ground intact. He found himself one of two captains in charge of just over 30 men, around 1/3 of the company force, and all that had been able to regroup after planetfall. Due to the storm cover, they couldn't raise the fleet in orbit, nor could they raise Eidolon or any other part of the landing force. Presuming Eidolon and any other part of the landing force had survived. The whole situation smacked of abject failure, and failure was not a concept the Emperor's children cared to entertain. To turn failure into something else, there was little choice but to get on with the remit of the undertaking, so they spread out in a search pattern to find the brothers they had come to help. On the way, perhaps they might reunite with other elements of their scattered force, or even find some geographical frame of referencing. Let's see, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So they see these crazy stalks of plants and these trees. Lucius, Tarvitz's fellow captain had found the first tree and called them all close to inspect it. It was a curious thing, apparently made of a calcined white stone, and it dwarfed the surrounding sea of stalks. It was shaped like a wide-capped mushroom, a 50-meter dome supported on a thick, squat trunk 10 meters broad. The dome was an intricate hemisphere of sharp bone-white thorns, tangled and sharply pointed, the barbs some 2 or 3 meters in length. "What is it for?" Tarvitz wondered. "It's not for anything," Lucius replied. "It's a tree. It has no purpose." In that, Lucius was wrong. Lucius was younger than Tarvitz, though they were both old enough to have seen many wonders in their lives. They were friends, except that the balance of their friendship was steeply and invisibly weighted in one direction. Saul and Lucius represented the bipolar aspect of their legion. Like all of the Emperor's children, they devoted themselves to the pursuit of martial perfection. But Saul was diligently grounded, where Lucius was ambitious. Saul Tarvitz had long since realized that Lucius would one day outstrip him in honor and rank. Lucius would perhaps become a Lord Commander in due course, part of the aloof inner circle at the Legion's traditionally hierarchical core. Tarvitz didn't care. He was a fine officer, born to the line, and had no desire for elevation. He was content to glorify the Primarch and the Emperor, beloved of all by knowing his place and keeping it with unstinting devotion. Lucius mocked him playfully sometimes, claiming Tarvitz courted the common ranks because he couldn't win the respect of the officers. Tarvitz always laughed that off because he knew Lucius didn't properly understand. Saul Tarvitz followed the code exactly and took pride in that. He knew his perfect destiny was as a file officer. To crave more would have been overweening and imperfect. Tarvitz had standards and despised anyone who cast their own standards aside in the hunt for inappropriate goals. It was all about purity, not superiority. That's what the other legions always failed to understand. Barely 15 minutes after the discovery of the tree, the first of many they would find scattered throughout the creaking grasslands, they had their first dealings with the Megarachnid. Benjamin, go the other way. It's time for class. Go the other way. Thank you. Go the other way. That's what I meant. Okay. Yes, children. The enemy's arrival had been announced by 3 signs. The larvae nearby had suddenly stopped hissing. The towering grass stalks had begun an abrupt shivering vibration as if electrified. Then the Astartes had heard a strange chittering noise coming closer. Tarvitz barely saw the enemy warriors during that first clash. They had come, thrilling and clattering, out of the grass forest, moving so fast they were silver blurs. The fight lasted 12 chaotic seconds, a period filled to capacity with gunshots and shouts, and odd, weighty impacts. Then the enemy had vanished again as fast as they had come. The stalks had stilled, and the larvae had resumed their hissing. "Did you see them?" asked Kercourt, reloading his bolter. "I saw something," Tarvitz admitted, doing the same. "Duralin's dead. So is Marcius," Lucius announced casually, approaching them with something in his hand. Tarvitz couldn't quite believe what he had been told. "They're dead? Just dead?" he asked Lucius. The fight surely hadn't lasted long enough to include the passing of 2 veteran Astartes. "Dead," nodded Lucius. "You can look upon their cadavers if you wish. They're over there." They were too slow. Weapon raised, Tarvitz pushed through the swaying stalks, some of them broken and snapped by frantic bolter fire. He saw the 2 bodies tangled amid fallen white shoots on the red earth. "Oh, thank you so much for the subscription. 4 months. Woohoo!" It's World Read Aloud Day, so we are reading aloud some Horus Heresy stories of the Warhammer 40k universe. This is from the very first book. It's about Space Marines on the planet known as Murder. And they have giant bugs there that are sort of like the bugs from Starship Troopers. Imagine the warrior bugs from the movie. He saw the 2 bodies tangled amid fallen white shoots on the red earth, their beautiful purple and gold armor sawn apart and running with blood. Dismayed, he looked away from the butchery. "Find Varys," he told Kercourt, and the man went off to locate the apothecary. "Did we kill anything?" Boule asked. I hit something, Lucius said proudly, but I cannot find the body. It left this behind. He held out the thing in his hand. It was a limb, or a part of a limb, long, slender, hard. The main part of it, a meter long, was a gently curved blade, apparently made of brushed zinc or galvanized iron. It came to an astonishingly sharp point. It was thin, no thicker than a grown man's wrist. The long blade ended in a widening joint, which attached it to a thicker limb section. This part was also armored with mottled gray metal, but came to an abrupt end where Lucius's shot had blown it off. The broken end in cross-section revealed a skin of metal surrounding a sleeve of natural arthropoid chitin around an inner mass of pink, wet meat. Is it an arm? Boule asked. It's a sword, Katz corrected. A sword with a joint and meat inside? Lucius grasped the limb just above the joint and brandished it like a saber. He swung it at the nearest stalk, and it went clean through. With a lingering crash, the massive dry shoot toppled over, tearing into others as it fell. Lucius started laughing, then he cried out in pain and dropped the limb. Even the base part of the limb above the joint had an edge, and it was so sharp that the force of his grip had bitten through the gauntlet. "It has cut me!" Lucius complained, poking at his ruptured glove. Tarvitz looked down at the limb, bent and still on the red soil. Little wonder they can slice us to ribbons. Half an hour later, when the stalks shivered again, Tarvitz met his first megarachnid face to face. He killed it, but it was a close-run thing, over in a couple of seconds. From that encounter, Saul Tarvitz began to understand why Kaites Frome had named the world Murder. So yeah, that's a really cool story. And again, that's the first introduction of two very important Emperor's Children characters. Lucius, who will go on to have a massive career stretching well over 10,000 years, becoming a champion of Slaanesh, becoming effectively immortal. He gets resurrected when somebody kills him, and all that kind of stuff. And then Saul Tarvitz, arguably the most honorable, most glorious hero of the Loyalists during the Horus Heresy, who dies in the third book. But what are you going to do? Or did he? They never found the body. He could come back one day. So I'm going to skip ahead to... We're going to go to the novel called Fulgrim by Graham McNeill. And we're going to read a very interesting part of the story. So now we've moved ahead into the Horus Heresy itself. People, Primarchs, Space Marines are starting to be enticed, lured by the Chaos Gods. They're exerting their influence. Arguably at this point, they have not completely fallen. They've not started fighting amongst themselves, but it's coming. It's coming. And the Emperor's Children, they ended up fighting on a planet, and they found there aliens worshiping something, Slaanesh, and it was this weird ritual they interrupted, and there was this crazy music happening, and these intoxicating gases filling the place, and there was this crazy sword that Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children, he saw it and he was entranced by it, and he took that sword for himself. At this point in the story, there are these characters called Remembrancers. Such a clunky name. But they're part artist, part chronicler, part sociologist who travel with the Space Marines, ostensibly to chronicle the goings-on in the Great Crusade. But they include sculptors, writers, poets, painters, you name it. So basically the artists who are living on board the Space Marine ships. And on the Emperor's Children ship, things have gotten a little weird. They're bards, Melpomene, yes. So on the Emperor's Children ship, people have been free to test out unique art forms and styles and mediums, and now there's going to be a concert aboard the ship that everybody has been looking forward to. So here we go. Julius, who is another captain among the Emperor's children, Julius watched with barely contained excitement as the blue-haired composer crossed the stage and descended into the orchestra pit to take her place on her conductor's podium. Dressed in a scandalously translucent dress of gold and crimson, the gossamer thin material hung with precious stones that glittered like stars. The cut of her dress plunged from her shoulders to her pelvis, the swell of her breasts and the hairlessness of her flesh clearly visible beneath. "Magnificent!" cried Fulgrim, clapping furiously with the audience at Bekwa's appearance, and Julius was amazed to see tears in his eyes. Julius nodded, and though he had no real memory of feminine splendor or any frame of reference against which to compare her, the composer's curves and obvious womanhood stole away his breath. Remember that Space Marines are arguably asexual. We have other records that they cannot reproduce unless there's a crazy mutation or somebody experiments on them. So, but there are scenes like this, it's like, okay, well, what exactly is going on with these guys? And remember also, well, and these Space Marines weren't even indoctrinated as children, so what are you going to do? It's weird. No, so Tiny Chris, Space Marines are, in current 40K, Space Marines are taken as boys, usually essentially prepubescent boys, trained, implanted with a bunch of extra organs, and turned into Space Marines. At this point in the story, though, these were men who that had happened to. So why this one doesn't remember what women are like is a little bit convoluted, but yes, and a man wrote this. Julius had felt such stirrings of emotion when he gazed upon his Primarch, heard a particularly inspiring piece of music, or went into battle. But to feel his senses aroused by a mortal woman was a new experience for him. A little weird. Thick silence enveloped the audience as they waited for the magic to happen. The collective breath of nearly 10,000 throats held fast as the moment of anticipation stretched to its breaking point. Bekwa selected a Nemo baton and tapped it on the libretto stand before launching into the opening bars of the Maraviglia's overture. I know all of you are adults and accustomed to the things that we talk about on this channel. I will give you a content warning. This gets a bit gross and a bit disturbing. So there. Tremendous noise erupted from the orchestra pit as the first notes blared from the newly conceived musical devices, the sound reaching to every corner of La Fenice, that's the theater, with its wonderful instrumentation, romantic beauty, and hints of themes yet to come. Julius felt himself carried on a journey of the senses as the music rose and fell, emotions he had never experienced plucked from the depths of his soul and brought joyously to the fore as the crashing beats and wild, skirling tunes wound their way through the audience. He wanted to laugh and then cry, and then he felt a terrible anger build before it bled away and a great melancholy settled upon him. Within moments, the music had torn that loose, and a soaring elation asserted itself with the utmost lucidity and force, as though all that had gone before was merely the prelude to some grand design yet to be unveiled. Bekwa Kinska thrashed like a lunatic atop her conductor's podium, jabbing and slashing the air with her baton, her hair a wild comet of blue as it whipped around her head. Julius tore his eyes from the magnificent sight of her and looked out over the audience to witness its reaction to this sublime, raucous music. Thank you for the follow, Blues Funk! We are reading from the third book in the Horus Heresy novel series in Warhammer 40k. He saw faces wrapped in stunned disbelief, eyes wide as the power and majesty of the dissonant sounds penetrated every skull and spoke to every soul of the sensations evoked. But not every member of the audience appeared to appreciate the wonder of what they were privileged to witness, and Julius saw many with their hands clamped over their ears, in the throes of agony as the music swelled once more. Julius caught sight of the slender figure of Evander Tobias in the audience, and his anger grew as he watched the ungrateful wretch lead a group of his fellow scriveners through the crowds toward the exit. Scuffles broke out, and the recalcitrant archivist and his fellows were attacked, fists pummeling them to the ground where they were kicked and beaten. And exactly, everyone's a critic. So there, again, some of these remembrancers are not a fan of how wild and crazy some of the other ones are getting. Without pause, the audience returned its attention to the stage, and Julius felt a fierce pride swell in his breast as he watched a heavy boot crunch down on Tobias's skull. None remarked upon the sudden bloody violence, as if it had been the most natural reaction, but Julius could see the bloodlust spread throughout the audience like a virus, or the shock wave of a detonation. The music swept onwards, rising and sweeping around La Fenice like a whirlwind, until at last it reached the thunderous crescendo of its climax, whereupon the curtain rose in a flurry of dramatic and spectacular sensations. Julius rose to his feet as the peals of music drove ever onward, the overture continuing in an unbroken melody of sounds, and the sheer, visceral emotions that filled him on seeing what lay beyond was like a punch to the guts. The interior of the Lair Temple had been recreated in painstaking detail, its eye-watering colors and dimensions faithfully recreated by the artists and sculptors who had walked within its magnificence. Vivid lights flashed around the theater, and Julius felt a momentary disorientation as more music blasted from the orchestra, a new piece with darker overtones and an aching sense of imminent tragedy. The waves of sound and harmony flowed outwards from the stage and over the audience, immersing them in the power and sensations he had first felt when he had followed Fulgrim into the temple. The effect was immediately obvious, and a shudder of pleasure rippled through the audience as the powerful notes flowed into and through them. Dizzying colors flashed through the air, and as the music built to yet another high, a second spotlight stabbed onto the stage. The slender form of Coraline Asenica, the prima donna of the Meraviglia, appeared. Julius had never heard Coraline's voice before, and was unprepared for the sheer virtuosity and power of her singing. Her tone was in perfect, discordant harmony with Beckwa's music, reaching heights no human voice could possibly attain. Yet attain them she did, the energy of her soprano's voice reaching beyond the realms of the five senses, all of which were being stimulated, it seemed, to Julius. So obviously we're using Julius Caesaron here as a focal character for this, and that is important later on. Tiny Chris? Possibly. He leaned forwards, laughing uncontrollably as an intoxicating rush of emotion seized him, and he clasped his hands to his head at such overstimulation. A chorus joined Coraline on stage, though Julius hardly noticed them, their intermingled voices allowing the soprano's voice to swoop through even more unfeasible notes, which reached into the very hind brain to pluck at sensory apparatus Julius was not even aware he possessed. Julius forced himself to look away from the stage, enthralled and terrified by what he was seeing and hearing. And again, this is a space marine, a veteran space marine, who is getting so inundated with sensation, he can't even stand it. What manner of being could hear music of such terrible power and retain his sanity? Man was not meant to listen to this, the birthing cry of a beautiful and terrible god as it forced its way into existence. Eidolon and Marius were as ensnared by the spectacle of the Meraviglia as he was, pinned to their seats in rapture. The jaws of both warriors were locked open as though they entertained the idea of joining with Coraline in song, but there was panic in their eyes as their mouths stretched wide in silent screams, bones cracking as they distended like a snake about to devour its prey. Hideous, soundless shrieks issued from their throats, and Julius forced himself to look at Fulgrim for fear that he might strike down his friends in his fugue state. Fulgrim gripped the edge of the Phoenician's nest, his special box seat, leaning forward as though forcing passage through a powerful wind. His hair writhed around his head, and his dark eyes burned with a violet fire as he reveled in the cacophony. "What is happening?" cried Julius, his voice swept up and becoming part of the music. Fulgrim turned his dark eyes upon him, and Julius cried out as he saw an age of darkness within them, galaxies and stars wheeling in their depths as unknown power flowed through him. "It's beautiful," said Fulgrim, his voice barely above a whisper, but sounding deafening to Julius as he propelled himself from his seat and fell to his knees at the edge of the box. "Horus spoke of power, but I never imagined." Julius watched in wonder, realizing that he could actually see the soprano's music as it reached out into the audience and slithered amongst them like a living thing. Their shrieks and cries penetrated the fog of music that writhed in his brain, and he saw all manner of horrors enacted throughout the audience, as friends turned and fought each other with fists and teeth. Some audience members fell upon one another with carnal lust, and the heaving crowd soon resembled a great wounded beast, convulsing in agonized throes of death and desire. Nor was it simply mortals who were affected. The Astartes too were swept up in the surging power generated by the Meraviglia. Blood was spilled as the emotions of the Astartes were overloaded with sensational excess, and were vented in the only way men bred as warriors knew how. An orgy of killing spread from the stage, blood running in rivers as the power of music thundered through La Fenice. Julius heard a great buzzing, creaking sound like a great sheet of sailcloth being ripped to shreds, and he turned to see the mighty portrait of Fulgrim writhing and stretching at the canvas, as though its painted subject fought to be free of the constraints of the frame. Fires blazed in its eyes, and a howling shriek that sounded as though it echoed down through an impossibly long tunnel filled his skull with a monstrous thirst and the promise of horrific splendors. There's a little bit of Portrait of Dorian Gray here with Fulgrim and a painting, and it traps his soul in a demon in exchange and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, that's what's going on there. Lights blazed around the theater, flowing from the orchestra pit like liquid, the greasy electrical fire lifting from the bizarre instruments and achieving physicality as they became liquid serpents of myriad colors. Madness and excess followed the light, and all those it touched gave themselves over to the wildest, darkest delights of their inner psyches. The orchestra played as though their limbs were not their own, their faces twisted into horrified rictus masks, and their hands frenziedly dancing across their instruments with violent life. The music held them in its grip and was not about to let any weakness on the part of its creators deny its existence. Julius heard notes of agony enter Coraline Seneca's voice, and managed to lift his eyes to the stage, where the prima donna danced in a wild, exuberant ballet as the choristers screamed in unnatural counterpoint. Her limbs snapped and twisted in a manner no human limb was designed to, and he could hear the cracking of her bones as it became part of the million melodies filling the theater. He could see that she was dead, her eyes lifeless, every bone in her body turned to powder, and yet the song poured from her still. The madness and frenzy engulfing La Fenice soared to new heights of excess, as all flesh was infected with the maelstrom of sights and sounds coming from the stage. Julius watched as Astartes clubbed mortals to death with their fists, and drank their blood or ate their flesh, scarring their skin with the broken bones, and draping the torn skin of their victims about them like grisly shawls. Vast orgies of mortals shuddered on the blood-slick parquet as the living and the dead became vessels for the dark energies pouring into the world, every violation imaginable willingly inflicted. At the center of the madness, Bekwa Kinska conducted the chaos with a delirious smile of triumph plastered across her face. Julia saw the knowledge that this was her greatest work in the light of her eyes as she stared in rapt adoration at Fulgrim. Then, without warning, a terrifying scream cut through the crescendo of noise, and Julia saw the abused form of Coraline Seneca twist into the air, her limbs spread-eagled, as some unknown power seized the broken meat and gristle of her body and warped it into some new hideous form. Her shattered limbs straightened, becoming lithe and graceful once more, and the flesh taking on a pale lilac hue. Where once Coraline had been clad in a shimmering dress of blue silk, the fabric transformed into a harness of gleaming black leather that revealed the supple beauty of the soft flesh formed from the ruin of her corpse. A horrific, wet, sucking noise engulfed the prima donna, and whatever force had previously held her aloft released her. The thing Coralina Seneca had become landed with supple grace in the center of the stage. Oh my god, thank you so much for for that. And it's a donation that goes to the model building fund up there. Julius had never seen anything so simultaneously beautiful and repellent. A naked female creature that evoked both a potent loathing and a perverse sensuality that gnawed at the pit of his stomach. Hair like needle horns swept back from her oval face with its green saucer-like eyes, fanged mouth, and luscious lips. Her body was a sculpted perfection, lithe and sensuous, but with only a single breast, and her skin was loathsomely tattooed and pierced. Each of her arms terminated in a long crab-like claw of glistening red chitin and moist flesh. Despite the lethal claws, the creature was disturbingly seductive, and Julius felt moved in a way he had not been since he had been elevated to the ranks of the Astartes. She moved with languid, cat-like grace, her every movement redolent with sexuality and the promise of dark pleasures and excesses unknown to the minds of mortal men. Julius ached to taste them. The she-creature turned her ancient eyes upon the choristers behind her and threw her head back to emit a siren song of such longing and heartbreaking beauty that Julius wanted to climb from the box and join her. Even before the note of summoning had dissipated, it was taken up by the frenzied orchestra and grew louder and louder. Julius saw the members of the chorus spasm and twist as Coralina Seneca had, the same bone-cracking harmonies transforming 5 of them into more of the hauntingly alluring creatures. The remaining choristers fell to the stage as dried husks of flesh drained of their life, as though merely fuel to power the transformation of the cavorting creatures that leapt from the stage in a flurry of slicing claws and bestial shrieks. The 6 creatures moved with sinewy, supple grace, the caress of their razor-sharp claws opening arteries and severing limbs with every lissom movement. Bekwa Kinska was the first to die, a monstrous claw impaling her from behind and ripping from her chest in a fountain of blood. Even as she died, she smiled in delight at the wondrous things she had done. The rest of the orchestra was torn to pieces as the beautiful monsters ripped through them with a speed and sensual malice that Julius could barely imagine. At last, the music of the Meraviglia fell silent as the musicians were slaughtered in the caress of razor claws, their lives torn from their quivering flesh. Julius cried out in the sudden void, the absence of the music like a physical pain in his bones. Though the music had fallen silent, La Fenice was still a deafening arena. The killing and copulation continued unabated, though the shrieks of agony and ecstasy turned to wails of anguish as the music's demise was mourned in renowned bouts of bloody madness. Julius heard Marius give a howling cry of loss and turned to see his battle brother leap from the Phoenician's nest to the stage. Fulgrim watched him go, his body quivering with emotion and pleasure, and Julius pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. He watched as Marius dropped into the bloody ruin of the orchestra pit and lifted one of Bekwa Kinska's bizarre instruments. Marius hefted the long tubular device and hooked it into the crook of his arm like a bolt gun, running his hands along the length of the shaft until it produced a monstrous vibration like the roar of a chainsword. Even as Julius watched Marius's futile attempts to recreate the music, more of the Emperor's children rushed to join him, each picking up one of the orchestral instruments and attempting to conjure the magic of the music once more. Julius felt the breath heave in his lungs and gripped the edge of the balcony for fear that his legs would not support him. What? Was all he could manage as Fulgrim moved to stand next to him. Wondrous, was it not? Asked Fulgrim, his skin glowing with renewed vigor and his eyes alight with fresh purpose. Mistress Kinska was a fiery comet. Everyone stopped to look at her, and now she is gone. We will never see anything like her again, and none of us will be able to forget her. Julius tried to reply, but a vast explosion of noise erupted from behind him, and he turned to see a portion of the stage wreathed in smoke and collapsing rubble. Marius stood in the center of the orchestra pit, electrical fire dancing across his flesh as he strummed his hands across the screaming instrument. A howling pyrotechnic blast of sonic energy shot from it and ripped one of the balconies from the wall in a devastating explosion. Chunks of marble and plaster flew through the air, and the sound of the instrument drew howls of pleasure from Marius's fellow Astartes. Within moments, each had mastered his device, and a renewed crescendo of howling, shrieking blasts of energy began ripping the theater apart. The monstrously beguiling she-monsters gathered around Marius, adding their own unnatural shrieks of pleasure to the delirious music he was making. Marius turned his instrument into the crowd and unleashed a thrumming bass note that built to an explosive climax. Clashing chords like howls of ecstasy tore through a dozen mortals with an ear-splitting concussion, and each of Marius's victims thrashed helplessly as their bones snapped and heads exploded beneath the barrage of noise. "My emperor's children," said Fulgrim, "what sweet music they make." Explosions of flesh and stone bloomed throughout La Fenice as Marius and the rest of the Astartes filled it with the music of the apocalypse. Yeah. So, yes, Marius and his batch there, his group of dudes there, they will become what are known as the Cacophony. That's actually a unit that you can play among the Emperor's Children in 30k, so in the Horus Heresy version of the game. And then, yes, the Cacophony will then turn into the Noise Marines. But yeah, that's obviously a really cool, wild scene. Let's see. Let's see what else would be good. 24. We'll skip. So again, that's in Fulgrim, which is the 1, 2, 3, like the 5th or 6th book of the Horus Heresy. But we'll jump all the way ahead to one of the most recent. So this is the Solar War. So things have gotten really bad by this point, some 50 books later. Horus and his fellow Primarchs. It's a cool name. And it's... Interestingly, I like the fact that they attempted this, but it didn't go super well. They actually, in the books and in the game, Cacophony is spelled Kakophoni. So it's actually a little bit closer to the Greek, but people had trouble understanding what it was supposed to be, and how do we pronounce it if it doesn't look like a word I'm familiar with, and other stuff like that. Oh, and also very noteworthy when this came out is that if you look closely, it's a little hard to see on this version, but we've got, so this is Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists here, and he's in charge of defending Terra, defending Earth from the invading armies. And you can see a bunch of other Space Marines on here, as well as some Custodian Guard around, and then there are various human soldiers. And if you look really closely, there is a variety of skin tones and racial backgrounds among these characters. And boy, did that make some people upset. There are black people in my future fantasy stories, my sci-fi fantasy stories. Fucking ridiculous. But yes, some people were upset by that. Dumb. Yeah, you know what, Tiny Chris, that's a good question. Oftentimes, yeah, I will take off the slipcover when I'm actually reading it, and then I'll put it back when I put it on display. Yeah, I mean, there were actually like angry threads and things online about that. Oh yeah, and it gets so bad with how some of the things are described. Again, one of the arguments that people use in Warhammer, and it's fair in that this universe is set up with such specific rules sometimes, but there's this idea that, especially among the Space Marines, because each Space Marine is implanted with gene seed from his Primarch, that they all have to look the same. which is not true. And even in these books, we hear about variations in how they look, and they recruit from different worlds or different places around worlds, and blah, 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 blah. It's annoying, stupid. Stop. Stop. Yes, Eridance, exactly. So this is the Solar War. So the war has come to Terra, or at least has come to the solar system. So we'll read a little bit about what are space battles like in Warhammer. And in this book, it gives you, in the chapter breakdown, I know Rabid Wombat, but that's how some people... Because again, we do hear that in some legions especially, like there are very, very clear similarities in how a lot of them look, but not all of them. And it doesn't, yeah, it's all pseudoscience bullshit anyway, it doesn't matter. So this next part takes place on the battle barge Monarch of Fire in the Trans-Uranic Gulf. So there are parts of the solar system where the enemy fleet is coming in. Clouds of dust filled the Elysian Gate. An open volume of space 3,000 kilometers across, it glittered with folds of fine particles. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of years of void ships translating to the warp at this point had seeded it with drifts of soft, gray matter that formed in the wake of a closing breach. The Jovian clans and the Navigator houses had a name for it. Siren Ash, they called it. There were tales, they said, of prospectors who had tried to harvest the dust and could desire nothing else once they'd touched it. True or not, the dust remained, slowly coiling through the volume of the Elysian Gate, like smoke caught in a glass orb. Oh, I should say this is the book The Solar War by John French. Both he and the other two authors I mentioned have written multiple entries in the Horus Heresy series. So they're talking about the Elysian Gate is, it's not a physical gate, it's just a specific place in the solar system where it's relatively easier for ships to exit and enter the warp. So, how far back do I want to go? Very briefly, in the universe of 40k, most factions travel faster than light by translating into a different dimension and then popping out at the right place. Kind of like hyperspace, kind of like the gate system in Babylon 5, stuff like that. But they travel through hell, essentially. So they have to have very special engines and shields to go into and out of the warp, the immaterium, different words for it. Yeah, Event Horizon, exactly. The gate had always been guarded. Things had come out of it during Old Night, things that the Uranus habitats remembered in tales of star vampires and iron men. They had built the first fortresses around the gate, watching it with guns and warriors. These stations were called the Eyes of the Old God, and they had kept their vigil as the rest of the solar system slid into the depths of the Age of Strife. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. All right. In the gate, the dust moved. A slow swirl gathered and coiled in on itself. Clouds, hundreds of kilometers across, flowed and folded. The dust began to spark. Tiny worms of lightning flicked between gray motes. The clouds began to glow, now green, now bruised violet, now bloodied ivory. The waiting fleets of warships lit their drives. In their sanctums, astropaths began to weep. In the habitats and stations, the low howl of warning sirens woke millions from dreams of shadows swallowing the sun. On the bridge of the Monarch of Fire, Lord Castellan Helbracht, commander of the second sphere of Sol's defenses, watched the reports blur across his sight as the helm of his Terminator armor locked in place. Fleet and defense-wide transmission, he said, the rich accent of the Nord-Afric conclaves weighting his words. See, he's from North Africa. Like, there are people in this world who are from different parts of even our planet. He saw the thousands of units under his command come to readiness in his helm display. The echoes of 100 warships' acknowledgments and salutes whispered across the Vox. He breathed out and spoke. For the light of Sol and the earth of Terra we stand. For the oaths we made, we stand. For the blood in our veins, we stand. For the stones laid by our ancestors, we stand. For the days that have passed and the days that shall come, we stand. For the living and the honor of the dead, we stand. Shapes formed in the glare, blinking into sight like shadows cast by the flash of lightning. The inner ring of gun platforms around the gates began to fire. Hundreds of shells blazed into the flashing dust. Some exploded, some vanished. The multicolored swirl contracted. The gun platforms kept firing. Then the dust and light burst outwards. A split opened at the gate's center, black beyond night. Across the gulf of the vacuum, the humans on the nearest gun platforms flinched as a ululating scream filled their ears. The dark hole flexed, its edges growing like a tear pulled wide in a ragged fabric. The fire from the gun platforms was a deluge now. Shells tumbled into the spreading breach. Those that exploded burst like water as they touched the warp. A trio of shapes appeared in the dark. Bloated and monstrous, they pushed into reality. They had been macro transporters once, made to shift the output of worlds across the galaxy. Each was bigger than even the largest warships. Slabs of raw iron had been welded to their flanks, and clusters of void shield generators blistered their skin like boils. They had borne other names in their former ponderous lives, but the will of Perturabo had remade them and had given them new titles to bear. Electo, Megara, and Tilfusia were their names, and they had been reborn to die in the first moments of this assault. The cordon of defenses opened fire. Long-range turbo lasers burned 100-meter-wide channels through the blazing dust in the gate. The ships pushed onward, molten metal weeping from their prows. Their void shields lit. Fresh storms of lightning blazed through the dust clouds as ether-charged siren dust kissed the forming skins of energy. The deluge of fire began to find its mark as the three huge ships shot forwards. The plasma reactors from hundreds of half-dead machines filled the trio's decks and holds. They lit, one after another. Power poured into engines and shields. Volleys of macro shells slammed into them as they shot out in different directions. Plasma conduits inside their guts began to rupture. Reactor containment began to fail, and thousands of the servitor crew died as their flesh cooked. Shells and lasfire crumpled shields and bit into iron skin. Fire chewed at them like rain into blocks of salt. It did not matter, though. They had not been made to live. In another age, back when Terra had oceans, such vessels were called fire ships. Crude mechanisms of horror and destruction in a time of primitive explosions and wooden vessels. On the defense platform, the gunnery officers saw what was about to happen as the three ships hurtled closer toward the first line of defenses. They did everything that they could to prevent it. Macro cannon fire tore savagely into the prow plating of the Tilfusia as her shields collapsed. A chunk of smelted iron the size of a hab block peeled back, tumbling away as lance fire reached inside the first wound and burned into the huge ship's bones. The Tilfusia erupted in flame and light. The blast wave reached back to the warp gate, staining the dust cloud orange. 20 gun platforms vanished, their deaths marked by blinks of light within the blaze as their magazines cooked off. It was only as the defenders' auspex and targeting systems went dark that the true spite of the ironclad vessel's makers became clear. Laced into the heart of the Tilfusia and her sisters were machines looted from dead forge worlds. Half wreckage, their spirits violated and rebound by the priests of the new Mechanicum, these engines had once been wonders of lost arts of communication. Now they were instruments of cacophony. Waves of wild electromagnetic distortion, scrap code, and haywire radiation ripped out with the Tilfusia's deathfire. The distortion wave scratched its way into systems, darkened signal receivers, and sent gunnery servitors into feedback convulsions. So there are all sorts of crazy, old technologies and stuff that they use, intermixed with spaceships fighting. Sorry, just catching up on chat. Oh, if these are all real people, real things happening somewhere out there. So there's a bunch of fighting, and I think I'll do one more section. Oh, okay, this one's cool. It is only a few pages long. So essentially, in the Solar War, Horus and his followers are coming to attack Terra eventually, but they have to get through a whole bunch of ships and defense stations that are in the way. So they have ships that come through at two different main points in the solar system where they're expected to come in. And then they rip open a hole just outside of the moon's orbit, Luna in the story. But then there are also some ships that come by a sneaky way. And we're going to talk about those next. Most of the defenders of Terra are arrayed in massive fleets that are waiting for these things to happen. But some just can't be constrained and have to do their own thing. So this takes place on the battleship Lance of Heaven in the suprasolar Gulf. The Falcon fleets turned in the abyss at the edge of the light. Quartets and trios of gray-white ships, they sailed alone in the dark, the orbital plane of the solar system beneath them, the light of the sun a burning dot. They were the ships of the 5th Legion, sleek and swift killers all. Having come to Terra, the Khan had broken his fleets into shards and cast them above and below the solar system's plane of orbit. There they circled the light of the sun like hawks around the falconer. I love that idea, right? So the 5th Legion are the White Scars, led by the Khan, Jagatai Khan, who is... Now this legion is... They technically come from Mongolians, so that's sort of built into their culture and also their looks. And they're always on the move. They don't like to be held in one place. They're hunters. They're fast, exactly. So they don't want to just sit there and wait for the enemy. So they're divided up into these little, what are called Falcon fleets, and they're scattered not within the Space Mongolia. They're scattered not within the actual solar system. But again, if you think of the solar system as relatively a flat disk, they are above and below in little tiny fleets that can move really quickly in case the enemy try to come from a different way. Some amongst the command hierarchy had wondered if the ships of the 5th should not have added to the fleet strength around Luna and Terra, or sent to reinforce the Martian blockade, as had been done with the warships brought by Sanguinius. The Khan had said no. His warriors would stand on the soil of Terra, but his ships were not dogs to be chained to watch a hearth. Their strength was in movement, in swiftness and flight. Rogaldorn agreed and had put an end to the dispute. The ships of the White Scars were scattered high and low above the circle of the planets, soaring free to watch the dark. The inner limit at which ships could translate from the warp was, fundamentally, a sphere centered on the sun. Ships not using the navigational gates at Uranus or Pluto could translate at any point on the invisible skin of that sphere. And just because the Elysian and Chthonic gates were primary beachheads, that did not mean the traders would not come from the plane above or below the system's orbital disk. In fact, in some form, that seemed a certainty. So the falcons of the 5th soared far from the sun's light and watched and waited. On the bridge of the Lance of Heaven, Jubal Khan knelt in armor and let his thoughts circle. His guandao, which is a kind of, it's like a halberd type of weapon, sat on the deck before him. Incense smoke rose from twin bowls set to either side of him. The Lance of Heaven had no command throne, just a raised platform of ebony and yellowed bone. Around it the crew moved, near silent except for when an order was barked. Through his slowed breathing, Jubal listened to the rise and fall of movements and the hum of machines. Always this moment before battle was the true storm, the building of silence and pressure before the flash and thunder. It was coming. Reports of death in the void had come from Pluto and Uranus, and the ship's sensors had seen the light of battles burning. Here, looking down on the disk of the system, those lights might seem distant, remote, but Jubal knew that was a false perception. This would be a battle to end all battles, a cyclone that would envelop all and leave nothing untouched by its passing. He could hear the storm's approach in the quiet. Memories of the past fell into his thoughts like raindrops. He remembered duels fought for pride, and wars fought for ideals that now seemed like lies told to children. He remembered the faces of all those he had been close to. Sigismund, his soul chained to his oath and his sword. Boethius, frowning as he worked to master the Guandao as the White Scars watched and laughed with derision and joy. Abaddon, bending to close the eyes of a dead brother in the red dust. He found himself unable to smile at the fragments of the past. I should also mention that the 5th Legion, as well as being amazing warriors and hunters... hold on one second. Blues Funk, you inadvertently wrote a phrase that Twitch says is a no-no, and of course we all say is a no-no, so I'm going to allow... well, I don't want to permit it always. Shoot. Okay, I'll have to see about how to re-add that to... No, I'm obviously a totally inadvertent. And yes, they have white power armor on. But yeah, I'll have to... I do want white power to be banned. I'll have to figure out how to re-add that to the list. But yes. But again, in addition to being hunters and ferocious, they are also... They are the quintessential noble savage. They're also poets and love... They get a lot of inspiration from nature and weather and things like that. What would become of them? What would become of them all in this storm that sought to wipe the truths of the past clean? He heard the rhythm of the command deck change and opened his eyes. What is seen? He asked. It's a cool way of asking, what the heck's going on? The Lance of Heaven's sensors saw one ship, then a second, and then more, ship after ship descending like a sheaf of arrows. Auspex readers hit paradox as they tried to identify individual vessels. Data drowned the minds of sensor servitors. Enemy strength values became approximations within seconds. 10, 25, 106, hundreds, thousands. Out in the dark, at a distance so vast that the fires of their engines were lost against the arcs of stars, an armada bore down on the Lance of Heaven and its 3 companion warships. The ships of the armada had begun their acceleration soon after they had materialized in the void, and flew now in a dense mass. "They have seen us," called an officer. Jubal Khan read the shock in the humans before he saw the data. The orders that came from his lips did so without hesitation. "To the wind," he said. The Lance of Heaven's engines flared to blue heat, and the great ship shot upwards toward the descending armada. The 3 ships riding with it kicked forward at its side. Thrusters fired down each of the 4 ships' lengths, punching them into spiral paths. Signals reached back toward their kindred fleet circling the sun and rippled toward Terra. "Enemy sensors have multiple firing solutions," came the call across the Lance of Heaven's bridge. "Approaching estimated maximum weapons range." "Choose the mark and send the call," said Jubal, his voice level and calm. A second later, the image of a single ship at the front of the armada flickered to being in a cone of hollow light. Hololight, like hologram light. It was a cruiser, large, but not one of the monstrous vessels that rode at its side. This was how they lived as warriors, how their Primarch and their forebears had fought on Trigoris, the marking of an enemy warrior in the first rank as battle was joined. Not a general, for a strong enemy would never let the arrows hit home, but not a soul without consequence either. For the first kill had to be noted by the great, and awe those that followed. Jubal watched the marked and chosen ship grow as Auspex and Cogitators parsed its identity. It was the 4-fold Wolf, a Legion vessel taken as a prize by the 16th when they were but the Luna Wolves. A good mark, a worthy kill. Jubal rose, his Guandao in his hand. He felt the judder of his ship beneath him as the spirit of its engines called out in fire. On the command screens, he saw the enemy horde draw closer, reaching out and out to the edge of sight. A cloud, a storm come from beyond a dark horizon. He realized he was smiling. "Loose!" he said. Torpedoes burned free of each of the White Scar ships, running straight and true toward the 4-fold Wolf. "They have range to us," called an officer. "Wheel," said Jubal. The Lance of Heaven and its escorts cut their engines for an instant, fired thrusters, and flipped over. Their engines ignited again, blazing as they drained power from every other system. The lights on the bridge of the Lance of Heaven dimmed. Jubal listened to the rhythm of voice and machine as the fourfold wolf realized what was about to happen and tried to turn aside from the torpedoes converging on it. It fired its thrusters, but it was going too fast. The torpedoes slid through its shields like iron arrows for a moment, its momentum carrying it on even as the explosions sent it tumbling. The ships riding close to it tried to pull clear, then its guts opened to the void, a red and orange flower of light. The first cut, said Jubal to himself, still smiling. Oh, cool. There's not a ton of spaceship combat in these stories, but there's some. And this book arguably officially has the best of all of it. Tiny Chris, they are spaceships. And yeah, no sails or anything, but they are decorated. There are literally I wish I had a picture close by, but they're super decorated. They are ornate. There are buildings on top of the ships. There are statues covering the ships. Some spaceships literally have books covering the outside of them. They're a little weird. And again, they kind of went a long time without being really specific in how the ship combat would work. So you don't get a lot of really specific descriptions. They tried to interject a little bit more actual physics into it, with acceleration and deceleration, things like that. But it's a little bit more fantasy than anything else. Yes, there used to be a spaceship miniature game for Warhammer where you got a bunch of little spaceships and fought it out. That game has been out of print for a long time. It's also a video game. There's a video game version of it that looks cool. I actually bought it, but I've never sat down and actually play it. Yeah, I have I'm two-sided. I would be very excited if they brought back Battlefleet Gothic as a miniature game, but I'd also be very nervous because I'd want to buy all the things. There are lots of people out there who make 3D print versions of Warhammer spaceships that are cool. So yeah, there's a little sample of some of the specifically Horus Heresy fiction. I had other things bookmarked, but it takes a while to read these passages. A little bit longer than I expected. Buy all the things. I know, I would be, oh my god, like if they did a Kickstarter, I would just like, okay, what's the highest tier to click through? Yeah, I love all this stuff. I read all of this a lot, and I thought it might be fun to share it with you. I've never read any of these books out loud, so it's interesting to try to get my mouth around some of the words and some of the complexities. But I think I did okay. And yes, I leaned a little bit more toward the Emperor's Children side. They're so cool in the Horus Heresy. They're okay later too, but they're really cool back then. I should get going. I have a lot of stuff to do today. Today, friends, lovelies. Oh, hold on. Stop. Mute. No. Okay. So I have more talks that I'm doing for World Read Aloud Day. And then 2 p.m. Pacific today, this afternoon, please come and check out. We'll be on Pete Wiz's channel, @PeteWiz. We are relaunching the Myths and Video Games show. If you never watched one before, typically what we would do on one of those streams is Pete would record him playing through a video game that has historical or mainly mythological aspects to it, whether it's characters, setting, story, names, you name it. And we would talk about it. We would talk about the video game itself. We would talk about the mythology or the history in it, where it's from, how the creators of the game altered it, why they used what they used, what cool stuff did they figure out with it, what more stories we can talk about, what other stories you could look at next. And it was super fun. We've looked at some really interesting video games and some really cool depictions of mythology in video games. Today, it is a subathon, so we will have some really fun incentives. We're raising money for equipment just for the show, basically an upgraded capture card so we can do all the games and be able to do them on any console and system. But today on our show, special time 2 to 5, we are going to create, in our heads and on paper, we're going to create our own mythology-inspired video game. So we're going to talk about, what's the setting, what's the character that the player portrays, are there options, who are the enemies, who are the friends, who can you romance in the game, what are the mechanics, all sorts of stuff like that. So it should be, and I'm really excited because Pete is like an expert video game player. I am not, but I know a little bit about mythology. And we have some special guests coming on, so it's going to be really fun. It's going to be a fun, yes. Oh, of course, I would assume if we're going to make a game, we're going to have romance in it, but it'll be up to the people watching and getting involved. So tune in for that at 2 p.m. today. Bracing for the genre wars, or we'll mash them all together. There are games that do that too, right? Tomorrow, I'm going to take a well-deserved break. But I will be back on Friday for Figure Friday. Probably do some hobbying because I didn't do it today. But we'll see. Trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's it. I think that's enough, right? So busy. Let's see who is online that we can raid. Should we raid our friend Nobby Lou? Red Strings Club. I don't know what that is. Let's find out. Let's find out, shall we? Come on, so slow. All right. Thank you for hanging out with me and listening to me read some Warhammer stories. I hope you enjoyed it, found it interesting. Like I said, it is World Read Aloud Day. So if you see the hashtag, like stuff, retweet it, whatever. If you have children or you know children, get on a Zoom call, read something to them. That could be cool. Whatever. Otherwise, have a great rest of your Wednesday. Remember, this afternoon we'll be at Pete Wiz. Will be the channel for the 2 p.m. Myths and Video Game stream. We'll be tweeting about that as well. Okay, we're gonna raid, say hi to Nabilu, and I'll see y'all later. Bye-bye. Okay.